All right, so in this video, we're going to talk about the world after the Cold War. So we're going to talk about modern issues following the Cold War. So the end of the Cold War brought a number of things to the world. There were two big consequences to the end of the Cold War. One that we're not really going to talk about here, but did happen, was that with only one real superpower, in this case the United States, there are fewer opportunities for some groups to have their voices heard. So when there were two superpowers, it was easy for some groups to talk to the United States, and if the United States wouldn't listen, then the Soviet Union would probably listen to them. But with the Soviet Union gone, there's only the United States left, and they don't want to listen to everybody, especially not the people that the Soviet Union was supporting. So they don't have their voices heard, which leads them to take more desperate measures. So we see an increase in terrorism as a means to be heard. It's a last resort, but that's essentially what terrorism is. It's a political response to not being heard. Now, we're not really going to go down that path in this video, but there was an increase in terrorism after the end of the Cold War. The other big consequence is this: capitalism as an ideology or as an economic policy won. That was the winning side in the Cold War, capitalism. So now everyone is doing it. And it's growing. And so the question now is that good or bad? And at this point, we're pretty much in the modern day, and we're beyond the point where history can really guide us anymore. So we're not coming up with answers. These are questions that are still yet to be answered. Is a fully capitalist global economy good? I think you can make an argument either way. But before we tackle that issue, there are a few loose ends that I want to tie up. Most of what we've done in the 20th century has been political and economic and technological. But I do want to go back a little bit and talk about some social and cultural issues. First, I want to talk about the role of women in the 20th century. And this is an example of the expansion of rights generally that we see throughout the 20th century. So women are one group that see their rights expand, and when we finish talking about this topic, I'll mention the other groups that also see their rights expand during this time period as well. Women saw their roles start to expand during the World Wars. So during the World Wars, women were forced into double duty. They were expected to take up the men's jobs while they were off fighting the war and maintain all their domestic responsibilities. And in the West, like the United States and Western Europe, women got the right to vote after the war, after World War I. And after that, that just kind of snowballs for women because now women's rights begin to expand faster. And mostly that's because politicians need to secure female voters by promising them expanded rights. Just like any other politician, you have to talk to your voters. And now that women can vote, politicians need to give them things in order to secure their votes. So, an example of this might be access to healthcare, equal access to healthcare. And for women, that means access to birth control or access to abortion. And as a result of this, in the West, we see a drop in birth rates. As the 20th century continues, women in the West begin pressuring non-Western governments to expand rights for women there. And this is an ongoing issue. Like most of what we're going to talk about today, this is still ongoing. So there is, for instance, an ongoing push to have more access to birth control. And we know that this is still ongoing because in the non-Western world, we see an increase in birth rates. And one factor leading to this is a lack of access to birth control. So as societies become more open to women having control of their reproductive systems, we see birth rates start to decline. But places where that may not be the case, we see increased birth rates. And this is, like I said, just one example of an increased expansion of rights. So this is evidence of a broader trend towards giving human rights equally to all humans. Regardless of gender or religion or race or sexual orientation. So the trend now is that we're giving rights to humans, regardless of what characteristics they may have. If you are human, you get the same set of rights that every other human does. There's one more social and cultural thing that I want to address before we talk about the big idea of globalization. And this is about medicine and health. And what we're going to see here is another difference between rich societies and poor societies. So first, generally speaking, we see over the last 100 years an increase in life expectancy. This is due to a number of things, but probably the easiest ones to pin down are better nutrition, and antibiotics. There are so many diseases that can be cured simply with antibiotics. And the widespread availability of antibiotics has definitely made life expectancy across the world go up over the last 100 years. However, we haven't gotten rid of diseases, though. And so in poorer societies, we still see diseases of poverty pretty commonly. So these might be typhus or malaria or tuberculosis. And these can be tied to poor sanitation or crowded living spaces. These are very communicable diseases, and so it's easy to spread them around. In rich societies, we see new diseases. Diseases of the rich are more common. So here we might see things like heart disease or diabetes or dementia because people live longer. Okay, so with those loose ends tied up, let's talk about the big modern issue, which is globalization. Globalization deals with the growing interconnectedness of the global economy and of global culture. So we're kind of seeing a homogenization of culture. We're seeing like one giant global culture. So anywhere in the world, you could probably find a Starbucks or a McDonald's. Anywhere in the world, you can probably find them. But it's not just American stuff that is spreading outside of the United States, it's also stuff coming to the United States and coming to Europe. For example, soccer is a global sport now. Everywhere in the world, you can find people playing soccer. Same with something like K-pop or Pokemon. These are global phenomena. And so when we think about a global culture, everyone in the world knows what these things are. Is that good or is that bad? It's hard to tell because we're still living in the midst of it. If we think about this in terms of economics, transportation, and so if we want an example of that, we could talk about jets, but we could also talk about these giant shipping containers, any kind of supersonic airplane, anything like that. New types of transportation and communication. And here we could talk about cell phones or email. Have improved to the point that geography is no longer a barrier. And so many times in the course of studying world history, geography was a barrier. Geography was a reason that the United States broke away from Great Britain. It was a reason why the Latin American colonies broke away from Spain. Geography was a barrier, but it's not anymore. We can get anywhere in the world in less than 24 hours. We can communicate with anyone in the world instantaneously. Geography is no longer a barrier. But there's a cost to this. All of this transportation uses fossil fuels, which lead to climate change. Additionally, we are really good at making stuff now. And we have so much energy and energy sources like fossil fuels, but not just fossil fuels. We could talk about nuclear power or renewables. So we're really good at making stuff, and everybody has and wants this new stuff. Consumerism is becoming a very important idea in the modern world. And it's linked to this stuff about transportation because it's cheaper to make stuff in Asia, like in China, or in Mexico, in Latin America, and ship it all over the world than to make it domestically. So we see that these areas, Asia and Latin America, are doing all of the manufacturing. And in the United States and in Western Europe and in Japan, the Western world is about consuming. So here we're doing the manufacturing, while the Western world is more service oriented and consuming those things. Globalization also leads to inequalities. Inequalities emerge from globalization. So Latin America and Asia are where most of the manufacturing takes place, which leads to those places becoming really polluted, while it's cleaner in the Western world. Additionally, people in Latin America and Asia are kind of trapped in the pollution because it's expensive for them to leave and go elsewhere. But it's not just about the pollution, because as climate change continues, climate change will make living by the oceans unsustainable. And again, only rich people will be able to move away from these areas. One thing that is good and is not an inequality is that we're able now to grow more than enough food. And this is the so-called green revolution. And the reason that we're able to grow more than enough food is through GMOs, genetically modified organisms. And a really good example of a GMO is dwarf wheat. Dwarf wheat allows you to grow a lot of wheat on a really short stalk, and that way it won't fall over under the weight of the grain. So you've got this little short stalk of wheat. The problem, though, and where the inequality comes in, is that there are other finite resources that people are starting to fight over. So we've got more than enough food, and because of dwarf wheat, we see a generally increasing population. But there are finite resources that we can't make more of. Like water. There is only so much water on the planet. And the more people there are, the more water is going to be something that we fight over. So there are right now conflicts between Syria and Turkey over the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And additionally, as more of these resources are used up by people, we see even more climate change. So we see more deforestation and desertification as a result of overextended resource use. There are some attempts to try to fix this. So, for example, there are some environmental movements to address these issues. And not just these issues, but really all of the issues of globalization and even the issues of the expansion of rights. So one in particular are green parties. These are political parties that address these environmental issues, and issues of social justice that arise from these environmental issues. All right, so I'm going to stop there. And this is Mr. Nissen signing off.